Russian War, which ended with the Berlin Congress and with the famous Article 61, which granted Armenians protection from the Kurds under the auspices of the European powers and the British power especially. And what happened in that moment in time? Through independence and through the persecution of Muslims in Russia, a series of waves of migrants happened, and they brought about a different view of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Abdulamin at the time had no intention of applying Article 61. In 1891, he created some specific regiments. These were true killers, true assassins, Kurdish assassins who would unleash their anger on the population, which then brought about the massacres of 1896 and 1899. Now, when analyzing these slaughters, two things come to mind. First of all, they had an impact on the Armenians, but also on the other Christians, because in this massive wave of anti-Armenian hate, all of the Christians actually paid the consequences. There are no details on specific events, but we do know that if in Mardin the population was able to defend itself from the Kurdish attacks in the surrounding villages, this wasn't possible. There were massacres which are difficult to analyze because data is missing, but they did take place. Therefore, there was a wave of anti-Christian hate which developed against the Armenians, and in turn this also had consequences to the other Christians, especially since an order existed to destroy the Armenians, and if other Christians were destroyed at the same time, there were no sanctions. I don't think we have fully understood the nature of these massacres, which were the embryo of the following genocides. Now, by reading the French press, in which there was a complete detachment from the French powers which supported Abdulhamid, and the press which referred to genocide. Territories or to convert. No reference was made to the term extermination, but fear did exist. And things changed completely with the arrival of ideology. Now, were we to analyze the genocides and what happened during the genocides of the 20th century, we have to understand that it is in the Europe of the genocides. That is a continent which then created the ideological roots for the genocides in the 20th century. Different ideologies, of course, but at the root of these ideologies you always had nationalism. That was a problem. The Union and Progress Committee began in the Ottoman Empire, in military circles specifically, but it also developed in France around political groups which are marked by French positivism, especially Pierre Leroux, who was a disciple of Auguste Leconte. Therefore, this was a completely pagan or atheist approach. These men who lived in a Muslim world began as atheists, and they remained atheists. And therefore, at the very beginning, with a certain intellectual honesty, for some of them at least, they decided to try to disseminate Ottomanism. They wanted to appear to the Western world, which was shocked by these massacres. They wanted to appear as reformers. They called themselves the Young Turks because they wanted to pump new blood into Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. Although this lyrical illusion, which began with the revolution in July 1908, was soon extinguished. And why is that? Well, because the Young Turks then developed the Turkish identity, Turkism. Turkey to the Turks. This was their slogan. And who are the Turks in Turkey? The Muslims. And therefore, although they were agnostic in theory, they used the Muslim religion as a tool for propaganda. And they developed this approach very quickly within Young Turk circles. And they would build a sort of a hate against all those who aren't Turks, or aren't Muslims. In other words, the Christians, the Jews, and other peoples. The Young Turks took power progressively, and up to 1913 they were a little bit to the sidelines, but yet they took power to avoid the dismembering of the Ottoman Empire. Although they did have to suffer a number of defeats. In 1908, the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, then Greece, Crete going to Greece, the massacres in Adana. And the first massacres were happening against the Christians, and when the army arrived, the massacres continued. The Adana massacres in 1909 were terrible, perpetrated by the soldiers who were actually sent to help the Armenians. Therefore, there was a huge danger in those years for the Christians. In 1911, there was the Italian attack, which marked the end of the Ottoman Empire in Africa. And then, especially in 1912, the First Balkan War took place. And the First Balkan War announced the arrival of World War I to a certain extent. Given its events, it also announced the violence against civilians, an extreme form of violence. A violence which shows that the Bulgarians and the Greeks murdered civilian populations on the other side. And the Turks were there too. The Turks were defeated in 1913. In January 1913, then the Young Turks took power. They took power with the murder of the Minister of War, with the Veritala, two accomplices, who then set up a government. A government which would be governed by a number of officials, including the Central Committee of the Union and Progress Party. From 1913 to beginning of World War I, all ideas of Ottomanism were abandoned. It was the years of Turkism or Pan-Turkism. In other words, the desire to reunite all of the Turks in Asia, especially the ones in Azerbaijan and in Central Asia. And then there were also the dreamers, the ones who felt that it would be possible to create an imaginary world from Turan to Iaso, a state going from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean. A dream, a murderous dream once the war arrived. Because by working on the genocide, we can understand that the war is a turning point. Anything which could have been avoided prior to the war, and it could have been avoided, could no longer be avoided with the war, because war grants permission to kill anyone, and war redefines the enemy's profile. The enemy is no longer a person or a group within. It is an enemy within the country. And in the thoughts of Turks, they became even more dangerous because they were invisible. And therefore, who were the most visible enemies? The Armenians. But the Christians too. And for the Turks, the Christians were enemies. And therefore, this was a threat which other Christians felt too, although it wasn't made explicit. Now, without going into all of the events which took place between 1914, when the Ottoman Empire entered the war, and March 1915. In March 1915, following the defeats suffered by the Ottoman Empire from the very beginning, the first defeat was in Sarikamisha, and then the defeat on the Suez Bridge, and the difficult situation when the Ottoman Empire thought that the Anglo-French troops would have reached Constantinople. The Turks felt that there would have been they would have to face the Allied powers in Constantinople, and therefore the Unity and Progress Party decided to destroy all Armenians. And there was a weapon to do this, a special organization. The special organization was an entity which would govern and manage all of the destruction of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. And naturally, this was perpetrated against the Armenians, and then it also extended. The special organization had two different poles, one of which was in the capital city with Enver and Azim, and the other was in Erzurum with Bedin Shakir. Bedin Shakir was the leader of the special organization. He was also the leader of the secretaries who are in charge of disseminating and organizing the killer squads throughout the regions. Therefore, ever since April 1915, the situation was specifically one focused on totally destroying the Armenians and a number of Christians, as we'll be seeing. It was a situation of true genocide. Yesterday, Madame Elobjet referred to two instances that I won't be going into. Although the first I want to go into is the one relating to Azerbaijan in Persia. At the time, the genocide hadn't already been decided. It was an event which is a part of the war, began by Enver Pasha, who, beginning of the month of October, began unleashing violence and destroyed the entire region, as we heard yesterday. This was war. These were slaughters. But had it been a genocide, I'm not sure whether or not the American and French missions would have been attacked to kill the Chaldeans and the Assyrians. It was a destruction of the Christians in the region. When Jefded was defeated, when he was confronted by the Russians and sent to the south of Ivan Lake and then go back to north, destroying all villages along the lake, it was still April 1915. And when the Russian army tried to enter the Bitlis village to no avail, Enver then entered the village and killed all the Christians in Syriac, especially the Chaldeans in the region. And actually all Chaldean men and boys were killed. And the Christians in Vilayet and Bitlis were also murdered. And some women and some survivors of Sirte reached Mosul. The figures aren't very accurate, although we do know that almost everyone was killed, and 90% of the population was killed. And we know that all the Christians of Bilayet and Bitlis were killed. There was no specific order showing that all Christians had to be killed, but it was an extermination. It was a war of extermination nonetheless. This was during the war, but the paradox is that the deportation orders which had arrived to evacuate Armenian populations, including Christian populations, from those regions. But then, in war, everyone is killed, and the deportations would actually refer to other populations, specifically the Chaldeans who lived between Urfa and Vilayet de Kapur, not in the north, not in the region of Trebisonda, for instance. I have to refer to Diyarbakir. This was a place in which shows the proof that there was a desire to destroy Christians in the Ottoman Empire. The will to destroy, which cannot be stated. We cannot understand whether or not it came from the central authorities or if it came from the local authorities, from Valid Rishil Bey. Dr. Rashid was one of the main murderers in this entire story. Dr. Rashid, a physician, one of the founders of the Committee for Union and Progress, was appointed by Talat and Walid Biyadikir in February 1915. He used to be in Mosul previously. The interesting thing is that there wasn't an official decision, although a killer they trusted was appointed. Therefore, Rashid, together with Bedreddin, together with Fezi Bey, the MP, organized the destruction in the region. Now, I don't want to go back to all the things which were mentioned on the events in Mardin. We know that obviously in Mardin there was a story of convoys of men with Chaldeans, Catholic Syriacs, who were displaced and then massacred. And apparently there was an order coming from the Sultan to kill the former and not the latter. But it is true that there was a telegram sent by Talat on July 12, 1915, which states that the Armenians had to be destroyed, not the other Christians. Although this isn't what happened, neither before nor after Talat's order. If we follow the evolution of events in Sayyad de Mardin, except for Mardin, where there were some differences between the Catholic Syriacs who could have been protected, in the surrounding villages, everyone was murdered. And this also spilled over to Turabdin. This is important in the sense that there was a geographical split in Midyat. To the west of Midyat, there were more Chaldeans and Syriacs. But then beginning in Midyat, at the heart of Turabdin, with the monastery of Zafaran, with the patriarchate, which is relatively respected because there were no massacres. But in the area surrounding Dibaldid, slaughters did take place, which happened around Midyat between the months of July and September. And these were massacres which affected a region in which there were no longer or very few Armenians. There were basically only Syrian Orthodox citizens. Therefore, Turan, Bardo, Bardet are just some of the villages which were destroyed following a heroic resistance. This was a region in which people had weapons in which they tried to defend themselves. We're familiar with the resistance of Arzak, which lasted until December. And all the parts in Vilayed, Saint-Jacques, and Mardin were destroyed, and especially the city of Nisim, with a Jewish population, in which Christians were helped both by Muslims and Kurds. Therefore, it was a very complicated situation. This was a Kurdish area, and the Kurds obviously have a huge responsibility in the massacres, but some Kurds also saved their neighbors. And this is also one of the elements of this genocide. In Algeria in September, all the Christians were murdered. The events which happened in Mardin and in the surrounding area in general shows that beginning in the moment in which the order was sent to kill all Armenians, the killers, be they Kurds or Turks, simply killed everyone, including the Christians, because they would have been sanctioned in any way. Yesterday, Professor Hello Bellier referred to the Assyrians in Akari. I have nothing to add to that. She was perfect. But obviously, we have to state that this was a situation of war. The population was armed and could have been armed, which means that the Russians took advantage of them, using them as soldiers. And Bashirun would save the population in the area, populations which would have been exterminated. Although no reference to genocide can be made until a real extermination would take place. I hope I was able to complete my presentation of this extermination. Do I still have 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 5 minutes. Thank you. After 1916, after the destruction of the Armenians, and after the destruction of a part of the Christian population, events continued with a number of massacres and persecutions. Persecutions which were no longer systematic, but which continued nonetheless until the end of the Young Turk power. For instance, think of the Catholic and Orthodox Syriacs. Think of the problems they had to face and all the events that they were victims of. But with the support of the West, the Lebanon, so to speak, it was possible to negotiate with the Turks. And therefore, throughout the war, there was a policy the Young Turks had in mind to promote a more homogeneous society, demographic engineering, so to speak. It wasn't simply a matter of the deportation of the Armenians and the other Eastern Christians. You also had the issue of the deportation of the Greeks due to their intervention in the war. Not the Greeks from Smyrna, who wouldn't have been deported because Greece did not enter the war. The Greeks were started to be deported in a moderate way. But then, once Greece entered the war, deportations increased. The Kurds were deported. All of Anatolia was completely redesigned to turn it into an entirely Turkish country. And this was the heritage which the Kemalist movement picked up after the Young Turks. Because all of the young Turkish officials then moved to Anatolia, and they found a leader there, Mustafa Kemal. And the heritage of Kemalism is the heritage of the Union Progress Committee. Yet the situation for the Christians who remained was tragic. Up to July 24th, 1923, with the Lausanne Treaty, with the episodes and the events of the war between Greece and Turkey and all those massacres. But then, following the departure of the last Armenians, there were some areas of Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and that's where the Kemalist forces decided to intervene. They felt that Turkey had to be Turkish and Muslim. And since everything was based on the rules of the Lausanne Treaty, which wasn't complied with, they tried to manage things in the following way. They started with the persecutions, with the exclusion of Christians from society. They began to impose heavy taxes on them. They were then grouped together and then forced to move towards Syria, which was French. And in Syria, actually, General Gouraud, as we heard yesterday, the northern part of the country was starting to organize a new population, which was then the roots of all the various Christian groups. But there was a different situation for the Turbdil, which is interesting. The expulsion of the Christians happened between 1922 and 1924, up to 1926. But it was only in 1925 that the Christians in the Turbdil were attacked due to the Shah Zaid revolt, the Kurdish revolt in Shah Zaid. This revolt proved that the border was sensitive, therefore the border had to be defended and protected. And with the presence of Orthodox Syriacs in Turbin, the borders had to be secured by expelling them, by making the country more homogeneous. And this was Kemal's program, along the steps laid out by the Union Progress Committee. I was given 30 minutes time. 30 minutes of time were imposed on me, and therefore, in conclusion, I'd like to say that I'm not only referring to numbers, figures. I am sitting here together with you, but in this very moment, people are being killed and threatened. I'm too old to go there, although I understand what you are suffering. I understand how angry you are with the Western world which doesn't understand your problems. A Western world which has already sacrificed you, I fear. And when witnessing the destruction, the misery, the pain of these refugees who escaped to their neighboring countries, and who have to continue to suffer in Turkey along the lines of the Ottoman Empire with the more radical groups within radical Islam. That's something we're afraid of. And I'll conclude with two phrases, two unique phrases, two sentences written by Victor Hugo, who was a pacifist. He dreamed of a final peace, a peace throughout the world. And he wrote The Massacres of Cuyo, which begins with, "The Turks passed through here. Everything is grief and death." And he asks the Greek child, "What do you want?" And the Greek child answers, "I want bullets."
Professor Ternone, thank you so much for your contribution. I'm not going to sum it up, but we realized that the Turkification of 1915, when Turkey wanted to make all the inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire as Turks, this is something which is happening also today. Turkey today again wishes to have all the inhabitants form another Ottoman Empire. This is the problem we are experiencing today. So thanks a lot, Professor Ternone. Now that I'd like to leave the floor to Professor David Gaunt, who is a Professor Emeritus in History at the Center for Baltic and Eastern European Studies at the Södertörn University in Sweden. He studied in the United States. He's a member of the European Academy for History and Archaeology and the Standing Committee for History at the Columbia University and Committee of Work on Turkish Armenian Studies. He has published many papers, and recently one was entitled Seyfo, the Syriac, Chaldean and Syriac Genocide of 1915. The complexity of the Assyrian genocide. Professor David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come to this wonderful conference. But you know, doing research about genocide is dreadful. Writing about it is dreadful, and probably even listening to the stories is dreadful, because you can do so little about it other than commemorating the people who were affected by it. I got into research on the Assyrian, Chaldean and Syriac genocides by accident. I have no relationships with these groups, but I am very happy to have had the opportunity and the privilege to write about them. When I was a teenager, my family lived in Hackensack, New Jersey. This is a place that people in New York will tell jokes about. This is the place where Tony Soprano and his pizza eating and ziti eating family were living. Now, but what I did not know is that it was the center for the Syriac Orthodox Church in all of the USA and Canada at that time. So if I went out of the door of our apartment house and turned right and then turned right again, I would pass a very normal American church, but with the priests running around in very unusual headgear. And if I looked closely, I would see one person that I probably wouldn't have known too much about, Mar Athanasius Yeshua Samuel. You know, the legendary person who found and collected the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that then got into trouble with the Israeli authorities and had to move from St. Mark's Convent in Jerusalem to America. Now, I'm going to take up a different aspect of Mar Athanasius Samuel. When he was just Yeshua, when he was a little boy. He was born in 1907, around Christmas time. So in 1915, he is 7 years old. He lives with his father, his uncle, his mother, and his little brother in a town, well, a village, Helwa, which is now in Syria, south of Kamishli, if you know Kamishli. It's on the border to Turkey. Now, this is just a little farm village, very close to the desert. It's south of where the Armenians are living. His father has come from Midyat, the main Assyrian town. His mother from Basibrin, also a large Assyrian village. The villagers there are bilingual in Arabic and Syriac. The Bedouins are their friends, and the Bedouins take care of the sheep while the Christians grow the grain and exchange this for everything. Everyone knows both Arabic and Syriac. And on one occasion, the 7-year-old boy is talking with the Bedouin who is taking care of the family's sheep. And the Bedouin says, "Do you know that the Ottoman Empire has been at war all winter long?" And the boy panics. I have a grandchild, he's 9 years old. I know how small boys can panic about anything. And he ran to his father and he said, "There's war going on, Papa, what should we do?" And his father, as a loving father, says to him, "Calm down. Nothing will happen to us. There is a war, yes, but they're not interested in poor farmers like we, and they're absolutely not interested in little boys like you." So, ominous words. There's nothing to worry about. By the time the war is over, his father, Somei, is dead. His uncle is dead. His little brother is dead. So of a family of 5, only 2 survive, him and his mother, and during the war they have been separated from each other. Now, Helwa was not a very important place. As I said, it's very far down towards the desert. So the war is not going on there. Oh, have you not heard? Okay, thank you. I don't want to go through this twice. Now, but when they were playing, the boys out in the fields would see far off there on the horizon small groups of people like ants going along on their way down south. We didn't know who they were at that time, but after a while we were told that they were Armenians. But on one occasion, one of these caravans of Armenians came very close to the village. They were sick, many of them dying of disease, probably dysentery, but they thought it was cholera. Those who were leading the caravan came to the villagers and said, they are fellow Christians, you must give them food. And of course they did. They gave them the food that they had. They were also told that these people were being colonized and they were sent down to build up a village somewhere between Mosul and Baghdad. So here the villagers for the first time really get contact with the Armenians and find out what is going on. In the night they hear shots. Everyone in this caravan had been shot. Almost all had been killed except for one person who crawls back to the village to tell them about what was going on. The tale that they were going to become colonists was false. The asking for a donation of food for the caravan was also false. The guards ate the food. He said also that the guards were actually newly released prisoners. Now, this is usually a rumor that comes in the tales, but I have actually in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul found telegrams from the Minister of the Interior ordering the release of convicts from the prisons in order to be guarding the caravans. Perfect solution. Now, this man is one of the sick, the diseased people, and Yeshua's father takes care of him well, as any Christian would do, and he is also afflicted by the disease and dies. So, all of a sudden, it's only the Uncle Yusuf who is taking care of the family. Before he died, the Armenian told of the defense of Van and the destruction of Van, about the murdered Armenians floating along the Tigris River all the way down to Mosul. His family was not prepared to accept these tales as they were, because no one could think that in such an advanced civilization as the Ottoman, that such things would actually happen. The Ottoman Empire was not a primitive empire. It was modernizing, though slowly, and people were thinking that it might be getting better under the Young Turk regime. However, danger grows throughout the summer of 1915, and even before the harvest is taken in, the people decide that they must move to somewhere more defensible, not on a flat plain, up to the north, to the mountains, maybe even get back to their original village of Basibrin, which could be defended. And so the men decide to go to the north and take as many people with them, while some of the women remain to take in the harvest and do the threshing so that they have grain for the winter. Among the women who stay behind is his mother. He, Yeshua, goes off with the men, his uncle and the others, towards the mountain, the plateau that is Turabin. He is not going to see his mother again for 2 years. On their way north, they are shot at by Kurdish riflemen throughout the area. When Yeshua asks, why are they shooting at us? No one in the group knows why. They are simply being shot at. Sheep are being killed. Perhaps they just want to get to the food. They enter a monastery that is up on the hill, the Mormalki, and find that there is a lot of other Christians hiding there really a lot in these sort of fortress-like convent structures. There's very little food, there's very little place, but you can sit down here, and after a while it becomes very obvious that the monks, although they are Christian generous, just do not have the resources to take care of them. So the men decide to go out and raid other villages, Kurdish villages or Muslim villages, to get food and bring it back. And on one of these occasions, Uncle Yusuf does not return. He is shot. So all of a sudden, in principle, Yeshua is an orphan. Among people who are strange, who he doesn't have family ties with, he gets sick. The convent is not a good place. People are shooting into the convent center all of the time. The more Christians they are there, the more there are attackers on the outside. So once again, his villagers decide to go even further north in order to get some kind of protection that they hope for. He is sick, Yeshua. He's carried on on a litter by people who are not his relatives. And he is heavy. They are in a hurry. He does not look well. They decide to leave him by the side of the road because they think he will not survive. But then, miraculously, he falls into unconsciousness and is found by someone who takes them into their home and nurses him back to health. He is there about 2 years in this strange family. And all of a sudden, his mother turns up. Things have calmed down. 1915 is over. Even the wiping up of Christian groups in 1916 is over. Most of the slaughter in the Tur Abdin area is over in December 1915. And there is an amnesty issued for the Assyrians, Syriacs, and Chaldeans. His mother has been looking for him for a long time and finds him in this home, and they are reunited. One of the first things that Yeshua asks for was, "What happened to my little brother?" And his mother breaks down and says, "Before the threshing was over, our village was attacked by soldiers. And in the confusion, little Malki, he ran away. I couldn't find him. Other people have told me that a soldier took him by the foot and threw him into a burning house. And he was dead." So, in order to survive, his mother decides that she could probably look for work in New Sabine, which is just north of Qamishli, where this Berlin to Baghdad railway is being built, finished. There is jobs there, even for women, and they tell her that yes, you can get a job if you are strong, if you can survive on a couple of olives and a piece of bread a day, if you can dig ditches till your fingers bleed, but most of all, if your Christian eyes can bear watching what is happening to the Armenians, prisoners, being beaten to death by the Turks. These are the words of Yeshua Samuel. So Yeshua's mother worked side by side with the Armenian captives, worked just as hard, but was spared the whiplashings and the verbal abuse that was being hailed on the Armenians. 9-year-old Yeshua makes friends among the Armenian boys and girls that are also hiding their orphans. He describes how they would together go to the rubbish heap and go through the scraps. They're looking for something that they could eat with fingers that are bony, finding a small piece of anything that they would throw into their mouths without looking at it to see how disgusting it was. And one day, this is etched in his memory, they were scrabbling through the rubbish heap together, and a German officer in all his fine uniform and his horse was standing by, looking on, feeding his horse with grapes that he was not giving to the boys. The German bystander, which is well known in the Armenian history of the... Now, what shall I say? When the war is over, Yeshua and his mother have survived. They're in Syria again. It is said from the Syriac Orthodox Church was the only one that actually made a good count of the number of victims. It was presented to the Paris Peace Treaty Conference and various foreign offices in 1919. Severinus Barsum, who at that time was the Bishop of Homs, had made a count. And I'm sure that there are documents behind this counting of 90,313 persons of the Syriac Orthodox faith who had been killed during the war. 156 churches and monasteries were in ruins. 154 priests and monks had been murdered, as well as 7 bishops. So this is just one of the many Oriental Christian churches. Now I have concentrated on one little boy simply because genocide is not about big numbers all the time, except in theory. It happens to people, even small boys. Even those who survive are traumatized. Now, what can we say about a testimony like this, about a 7-year-old boy that was written by a man who was 50 years old going back to it? Is it likely that his father told him, when he first asked him, not to worry, that poor farmers and little boys are not going to be affected by this war? This is probably true. This is something that a father would say to a 7-year-old boy. And as far as he knew, the war was way up in the Caucasus or along the border to Iran. So it might have been true. And it's probably a story that his mother told him time and time again when he wanted to know about his father. What about the story of the soldiers who had come into the village and burnt it and killed people? This is also probably true because we knew that in the nearby town of Nusaybin, a death squad had been organized. We know the names of the perpetrators, and they were commissioned to make a sweep of the Christian villages to the east of Kamishli, which they did do. Now, what is this story not telling us? Well, the first thing is, what happened to his mother after the village was burned? Now, normally, a woman in her age would have been kidnapped and held hostage, maybe forced to become a Muslim, held as a sex slave, then released when the man tired of her. Now, this is probably what had happened to her. Now, obviously, she has not told her 8-year-old son this. Who would? So he does not know this. Probably she never talked about it again in her entire life. And was haunted by the memories of that. Now, let's talk about victims. His father had no idea that they were in danger until it was too late. The victim group obviously had no idea why they were being attacked, and often it's this the problem with dealing with testimonies of survivors. They have no direct idea of what is going on. The things that Yves Ternon was talking about that were going on in the Young Turk government, those discussions, they were saying things like, well, the Sultan has ordered this. There is a firman against us. And they may not even know who the Sultan is. They may not know that there are Young Turks. There is a feeling of not being in control of your situation. There's something that we also know from Holocaust research. If you know why you are being victimized, you sometimes have a higher chance of survival. Here, no one knew what was going on, only that they were in grave danger. Sometimes in the testimonies from the Syriac sources, like Gallo Szabo that we were talking about yesterday, said, God is punishing us for our sins. Oh, perhaps. The point of this presentation was to show how an individual fate can give you some inclination as to what was actually happening to people behind these great, the great idea of Turkification, how people managed to survive by sheer luck and accident. There is no, you simply cannot survive of pure cunning. You have to have a lot of luck. Miraculously, Yeshua Samuel did. And I thank you for listening so patiently to this.
Grazie, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much indeed for sharing the story of the suffering of a family, a Syrian Orthodox family, which gives us an idea of the suffering of all of the Christians in that area at that time. Since His Holiness, the Patriarch Ephraim, didn't agree with the figures you shared concerning the martyrs in that area. This is a figure given by one of our patriarchs, although I believe that figure has to be updated. Thank you very much. And we now want to give the floor to Naras Atto, who belongs to our church. We are friends. We studied Syriac together in Holland. Naras teaches at the University of Cambridge, and she leads the Aramaic Online project. The PhD in research at the University of Leiden in 2011. She is the author of a number of books, and she is the co-editor of the upcoming volume titled Seyfo, Genocide in the Ottoman Empire. And she is the director of the Inanna Foundation in the Netherlands. Professor Narasato, you have the floor.
Abun Ma'alio Mor Ignatios Ephraim Traiono, Abun Ma'alio Mor Ignatios Yusuf Tlithoyo Yunan, Hasim Yakre, Your Excellency, dear fathers. I would like to thank the Community of Sant'Egidio for inviting me to this, for me, important conference. As a third-generation Seyfo survivor, I'm grateful for having been able to talk to the first generation of Seyfo survivors and to their children, to my parents, the luggage of my grandmother, it's not only inspired me, but it has also haunted me until today. But I'm here not to talk about the Seyfo directly, but about one of the many consequences of the Seyfo, about the dilemma, hostages in the homeland, orphans in the diaspora. David moved me, although I read his testimony, but today, yeah. So when I met Mor Gregorius Johanna Ibrahim, Archbishop of the Syriac Orthodox Church in Aleppo, during one of his visits to the Netherlands in 2011, I mentioned to him the title of my book that was about to be published, Hostages in the Homeland, Orphans in the Diaspora. He looked at me with a worrying face and asked, "But why have you chosen for such a dark title? Choose something positive, something different from hostages and orphans." I answered after 2 seconds. I needed some time to understand his comment. I said, "I have written my book from the perspective of my informants, and this is what they have communicated to me." 2 years after this conversation, we heard that Mor Gregorius Johanna Ibrahim was abducted, and we still do not know his whereabouts. We pray. The modern immigration of Christian communities from the Middle East to Western countries can be dated back to the end of the 19th century and to the beginning of the 20th century. Massacres and the genocide during the First World War in Ottoman Turkey dislocated the Christian communities from the Middle East drastically. The existing population statistic revealed the fact that before the genocide and the population exchange, more than 10% of the Ottoman population consisted of non-Muslims. In the post-genocide period, this went down to less than 1%. In the 20th century, the position of Christian communities in the Middle East weakened also drastically. In the post-genocide period, they had to seek for ways of survival in the new status quo in the newly established nation states after the First World War. Survivors lost a great percentage of their community, their property and cultural heritage was destructed or taken over and converted. Since then, they have also been subject to the politics of assimilation and have had to obey to the politics of the majority groups in society. In the post-war period, they also became almost invisible as citizens in society, in the economic sphere, and in the material culture. Characteristic for their attitude in the decades thereafter in the Middle East has been their attempt to remain anonymous and live a more isolated life. Until today, Christians are perceived as Gawur, infidels, and as the allies of Western powers. In the discourses of Gawur, Christians are portrayed as traitors and potential enemies. Especially potential enemies can develop into horrendous event if the majority powers want to. These discourses legitimize all types of oppression, including killings, massacres, rape, and the capitalization of their properties. Several of my informants use the following expression to refer to their position in the Middle East, which they have considered their ancestral home. I quote, "We lived with the stick of Muhammad above our head all the time," unquote. Here, the Muslim Prophet Muhammad is used as metaphor for Muslim rule. Christians in the Middle East considered this geography to be their home and wish to continue to live there, but the continued crises in this geography have left them with little hope to be able to do so. We have seen that with the increased sense of feeling unsafe and left to the mercy of extremist groups such as that of the Islamic State more recently, those who can decide about their fate mostly decide to leave and settle in Western countries, even if they have to pay their life savings in order to get away. The starting point for this paper has been fieldwork among Syriacs in Sweden, where I conducted over 70 in-depth interviews with this first generation about their identity discourses in the period 2003-2005. In this paper, I would like to discuss the experience of what I have termed the hostages and orphans dilemma among Syriacs in Sweden and the different approaches to dealing with it. I use the term Syriacs here for this case study, more specifically to refer to the members of the Syriac Orthodox Church among whom I conducted my fieldwork. Syriacs, they are mostly unknown to the general audience. They consider themselves to be among the first Christians and indigenous to the Middle East, yet stateless and powerless. These two elements, Christianity and historical rootedness, have played an essential role in their collective identity and their sense of belonging. Despite their historical rootedness in the Middle East, their religious affiliation has set them apart from majority Muslim societies and pushed them into the periphery. Since about the 1960s, Syriacs from Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria settled in increasingly large numbers in Western countries. Their mass migration from Iraq began after the Gulf War in 1990 and increased even more after the American invasion in Iraq in 2003. The situation got worse after the Islamic State expelled Christians from their historical homes, used all kinds of violence against them, and took over their property last summer. Beginning. The international community is witness to what has taken place and referred to it as a situation of genocide, comparing it with the victimhood of experiences of Christians during the genocide of 1915 in Ottoman Turkey. Similar to the situation in Iraq, since the civil war in Syria began in 2011, Christians have been among the most vulnerable groups in society, especially after IS began to rule their inhabited areas. The fact that Christians have not had their own trained militias made them even more vulnerable, or at least has left them with no hope of being able to defend themselves. Since recently, they have some small militias who are involved in the defense of the people remaining in the country, although their power as such can be considered negligible compared to that of other groups involved. Becoming orphans. Today, more than 200,000 Syriacs live in Western European countries, while most of the areas they emigrated from have been emptied of community members. With their emigration, they also came to be dispersed ever more than before. Nowadays, Syriacs refer to their mass migration as a second genocide, implying, here the implication is important, the great risk for disappearance as a people due to assimilation in Western societies. So they imply that their disappearance will not take place physically, but due to their cultural extinction. One of the main reasons for their emigration to specifically Western countries has been their expectations that these Christian societies, would understand the problems of Christian minorities in the Middle East, and that they would take care of them. I have referred to their image of Europe as heaven, a mythical space, as a remedy for all their problems. In reality, Western countries have not dealt with them different from other migrants. Only few have been acknowledged as refugees, something which Syriac perceives generally not right. Considering their experiences and position in the Middle East. Especially during the period, the 1970s, 1990s, Syriacs struggled hard before they were granted asylum. I wanted to show you an image of a family from the 70s taken by a journalist. The whole family hid themselves behind their hands, even the baby who sat in the lap of her mother, because their status at that moment was of illegal people, and they had to leave Sweden, so they hid themselves and tried to seek attention from society through the media. In the end, very few have been sent back, but they had to struggle, and it also shows how much they wanted to stay in Western countries. So in the process of negotiating their settlement in Western countries, they learned more about the role of religion in society and began a process of reformulating their collective identity based on new context of living, which was more secular. I will not elaborate on that here. Over time, the majority of Syriacs have established themselves outside their perceived historical homeland. Among the older generation, a common expression have been, I quote, "We have found a shelter place for ourselves in these countries." In modern Aramaic, they would say, "Mastallan ruhan ba'athrawu thani." In the Western countries, they have enjoyed freedom of expression, gained access to education, developed their economy, became politically active at different levels, and participated in society in a broad sense. From the beginning of their settlement, they established secular associations where they got together to socialize and to discuss their position in society. Especially Sweden was very generous in granting opportunities to organize themselves. And because of this, you see a big difference between the development of Syriacs in Sweden and those in other European countries. Although this has resulted in their visibility in society and to a certain extent in their non-formal recognition as a distinct group of people, altogether, yeah. To mention a few examples of this visibility, they have 2 soccer teams that managed to reach the Premier League in Sweden. They have 5 members of parliament in Swedish parliament. Several research has shown that they are the most successful immigrants economically, and that the educational level of the younger generation is the highest among immigrants in Sweden. After realizing that they were involved in and witnessing the process of founding permanent settlements for their people outside the ancestral homeland, they began to question their evolving diaspora and the future of their people in the diaspora. Having escaped the situation in which they lived the life of hostages in their ancestral homeland, in the diaspora, they have started to feel orphaned because of establishing permanent homes outside the ancestral geography. This is the moment when they begin to experience what I have called the hostages and orphans dilemma. The focus in this dilemma should be more on the sense of becoming orphans, because that is what is new and the majority of Syriac are concerned with. Far less people have been left behind back home in a position of hostages. This also indicates their future orientation in relation to where home is and where home is going to be. When speaking about the Syriac diaspora, then a historical homeland to connect to is necessary. The Syriac diaspora can only exist through the social imaginary of an ancestral homeland. Without a homeland, there cannot be a diaspora. Consequently, to speak of the dispersion of one's people from a geographical area is communicating where the ancestral home is. This perspective reroutes all imagined members of the community in a homeland in order to continue to exist as a collective. It's the creation of the myth of a united people, although living dispersed in the diaspora. Emigration from the homeland and the worldwide dispersion has also been an important theme for Syriac songs produced in the diaspora. The first songs and poems about Turabdin are from the beginning of the 1980s. It's the time that many Syriacs settled in Europe and became aware of the collective rupture with Turabdin. One part of their ancestral homeland is southeastern Turkey, at the border with Syria, for those who don't know about it. The melodies of these songs are mournful, as is common among Syriacs when lamenting about their death. The lyrics deal with the worldwide dispersion of Syriacs, with the idea that the homeland has become empty of Syriacs, with the friends that they lost touch with, and with the nice memories of family and friends in the village. The homeland is romanticized. It's remarkable that in this genre of songs, they do not sing about the bad times or bad experiences in the homeland. In the last few decades, Syriacs have been discussing the balance of their settlement outside the ancestral homeland in terms of gains and losses, faida و khsara. For example, this topic was discussed in 2006 in a TV program on Suroyo TV, a satellite TV channel of Syriacs based in Sweden. Oh, Tawdi Barak Mor Sayna, Tawdi Sanki. Thank you for allowing me to think about my grandmother who always had sweets with her. Thank you. So, in this TV program on Suroyo TV, one of the activists who considered himself to be one of the guards of the culture and future of people generally, and he about his in his 50s, he says, I quote, "There are many things that we don't feel at ease with and many things we do. In the first place, when our people came to Sweden, they felt comfortable since they learned that they were not oppressed and that there was no danger of being killed here. And besides that, they learned that they could develop well economically. We won two things, but we lost many things. We lost the family life, the culture, the identity, which is disappearing. The Syriac identity has become displaced, mza'za'u," he said. In the homeland, we knew ourselves as being distinct from the other people, and therefore we were able to maintain our identity. We knew ourselves as Christians, but we also knew that we were not Turks, Kurds, or Arabs, unquote. The older generation discussed the position as hostages in the homeland as something that they have left behind them. That was the past, a curse from which they have distanced themselves, to which they do not want to go back. Instead, they express the idea, I quote, "The homeland should be further removed from there," unquote. And they say it with an angry tone because their first choice would probably have been to stay there. Like one lady said to me, when we had to leave it, I would rather have died there than leaving, but I want to go back to that hell. A young man, he is born in Germany, and he produced in 2009 for his education a documentary film, which is about 1 hour, about his grandfather back after 30 years of settlement in Germany. And just after a few days that they have been there, I wanted to show it to you, but there is no equipment. The grandmother is confronted with the fact that the Turkish military started to burn the land. So in the distance, at night, you can see the burning flames of their land. And then again, fear develops. And she says, well, most important is that we get through this night alive. And after I leave this place, I will never, ever go back to it. So for the older generation, leaving the homeland behind becomes a necessary evil. They mourn the homeland and talked about it with sadness, but decide to continue their life in foreign lands. As they refer to it, they say, "Nukhraito." Inukhraito. Their main concern becomes their future in Europe, because they don't have any hope in the homeland anymore. In the diaspora, there are the new challenges. The first and older generation have been distressed with new challenges they have been facing. The great change from rural societies they migrated from to highly modern societies in Europe has confronted them with a whole new set of norms and values and challenges to adjust to. But I will not elaborate here too much on that. Parents have been very conscious of especially challenges regarding raising their children in the new societies. The older generation experienced the hostages and orphans dilemma passively. They have been living it without knowing well how to search for solutions. I quote, "We do not know what to do," they would say. This is another position as orphans in the diaspora. They feel helpless in a modern world which they have entered at an older age, not being able to understand it or how to deal with some of the new norms and values which they have encountered. Expressing their frustration with the situation, some parents use the following expression, I quote, "The stick of Muhammad is no longer above our heads, and that is why we have started to live excessively," unquote. And of course, this is said in an angry way. Sociologically, it indicates the change in society that was very much regulated, bounded to a very free society where people had to adjust their new lives. Some answers to the hostages and orphans dilemma from the more younger elites or activists. The approach of the younger elites to the hostages and orphans dilemma differs from that of the older generation. In making up the balance of the gains and losses of the migration, the younger elite have an active, collective, and future-oriented approach. The starting point is their idea to save their people from extinction. Big words, but of course, they don't know better. Both in the homeland and in the diaspora, they talk in terms of rescuing our people. The great dispersion is problematized from the perspective of being an ethno-national group of people, an UMTHO. The dispersion to the four corners of the world is perceived as the first step in the process of disappearance. Many Syriacs have referred to their situation in the Western one where assimilation is lurking. I quote, "Europe is a deep sea in which we can whether you want it or not," unquote. Realizing their relative small and dispersed numbers, they see themselves as the little boat that can and that will sink in the future in this big sea of what is Europe. There is an autodidact artist in Germany, and he considers himself also an activist. He must be in his 50s at the moment. I wanted to show you a drawing of his, but I can't again. In this drawing, in the upper part, he shows the position of Syriacs between the Kurds and the PKK guerrilla and the Turkish military. And then on the left side, you see two arms pulling the chains of the boat that is trying to enter the sea. These hands refer to people in those days in Tur Abdin who tried to keep people, Syriacs in Tur Abdin, but who could not. And then you see some people falling already off this boat, an indication for the assimilation of in Europe if people would enter the sea. So elite members have developed strategies to overcome the danger of assimilation and extinction of their people in the diaspora. From the modern perspective on the nation, the state of permanent dispersion and settlement in the diaspora is not ideal. The majority of the members of a nation are living in one geographical territory. In the modern Syriac diaspora, the mobilized notion of a nation, UMTHO, has developed the function of maintaining unity in a state of worldwide dispersion. This notion seeks for freeing the hostages in the ancestral homeland and for ending their sense of being diaspora. How many minutes? 5? When making up the balance between gains and losses resulting from migration, the elite focus more on the gains. They underline especially the many opportunities that they have had to develop as different areas. It's in this direction that they search for answers to the experienced hostages and orphans dilemma. They make use of the available space in Europe to stress and develop specific elements of their culture and value their cultural, political, intellectual, and economic development. Parents are encouraged to send their children to Syriac language courses and to teach the younger generations about cultural aspects that are perceived as part of their cultural heritage. Seminars and other activities are organized around political topics related to Syriacs. They use nourishment in the diaspora as a way to root themselves in their future homelands. This focus indicates that they do not have much hope left that Syriacs can return to the ancestral homeland and enjoy certain human rights as the indigenous population of the region. But the younger generation gives, interestingly, at a different level, a considerable role to the ancestral homeland. In contrast to the older generation, the younger one attempts to redefine the role of the homeland and to continue to give it some function in their life. With this in mind, Syriac elite members request specific human rights for their people in the homeland in the Middle East. More rights in the Middle East will make it possible for Syriacs, for those who are still there, to stay there. At the moment, to live in the ancestral homeland is more of a burden than a delight, and those who continue to live there are perceived as heroes, if not living martyrs, because of their life for the homeland and the daily difficulties that they have to live through. This fits in their ideas about the future of their people in the diaspora. Improving the position of Syriacs in the ancestral suggests also an increasing possibility to be able to continue to live as a distinct group in the diaspora, because they will be able to remain connected to the ancestral homeland. So this is an attempt to make an end to the notion of being orphans in the diaspora. It works in two ways. By rooting themselves in the ancestral homeland, they also position themselves in the society of a future homeland in the diaspora. A permanent rupture from the homeland, on the other hand, can the assimilation process in the diaspora. The role of the homeland changes thus from a functional one where one lives physically to a functional symbolic role that is used for the survival of a group of people in the diaspora. The symbolic role of this ancestral homeland indicates that the homeland is imagined, constructed and reconstructed from a distance. As a third point, there is also the idea of the return to the ancestral homeland. It's an idea that is mobilized by the political activists, but in today's political reality, this becomes even more unrealistic than a decade ago. Thank you for listening.
Grazie, Nauras.
Thank you so much, Nauris. You have been speaking with your heart because you come from a family of migrants. So she actually tried to analyze the society in Sweden and the Netherlands, where she had been living before getting married. Thank you so much, Norris. And now I'm going to give you some good news. We have 15 minutes of break. But please be back in 15 minutes sharp, because after that we shall have 2 more contributions, one by Mr. Riesen and then the conclusions drawn by Marco. authored 5 of the 7 volumes with the documents in the different Vatican archives. So this is the last one on the Armenian issue. 1894, 96, and 1908, 1925. Father Georges, you have the floor. And we have more than 15 minutes. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. This is the good news. I can speak a bit longer. It's so hard to speak briefly. Very often people tell me I'm quite talkative, but that's right. Jesuits think that they have so many things to say. And this is why I wrote everything down. So I'm going to read. And I will be certain to stick to the time allotted to me. But I will be speaking French, if you allow me. It's a great honor for me to be here with you today, and especially to be able to participate in your symposium. First of all, I wish to thank Professor Riccardi for inviting me to deliver this short presentation this morning, connected to your conference about the Seyfo year. Obviously, I know what happened and I know this event, so it is right to commemorate them in the year of the Armenian genocide. Who is going to remember that? This is the title of the book by Professor Jakub that I had the possibility of meeting today. Here we want to commemorate. We don't want to be argumentative. We don't want to be controversial. We want to recognize and deal with the truth. Just the truth. Remembering the words of our Lord saying that the truth will set us free. This is the only word. This is the truth that will set us free. This is what we need to say to those who deny. The truth will set you free. This is what we should tell those who deny or who reject the facts. They must be faced with historical testimonies. And this is a long exercise. It requires research. It's a painstaking exercise. Often we wonder, what is all of that for? What is the meaning of talking about the truth if they keep denying? So we can ask this question, what is this for? First of all, it is necessary in order to pay a tribute, not to stay in silence, not to forget these terrifying experiences, this genocide. It's a sacred duty, it's a holy duty. And researchers here have spent their lives on this truth. So truth should never be buried. Lies, denials, they should never be disguised with the veil of the truth. And I think it is quite important because it proves that we can never have a lie to cover the truth, to discuss the truth. So it's essential to leave the floor to the sources. So 7 years ago, in this regard, I started publishing the historical sources kept in the Vatican archives pertaining the Armenian issues. We looked up in the archive for the Vaticans and also the archives of the Congregation for Oriental Archives and the Secretariat of State. So 7 volumes. The first 5 volumes have been published already. Professor Impagliazzo has just shown the 5th volume, published 3 weeks ago. The span of time is from 1984 to 1925. The Vatican sources are especially rich and interesting, but they are also original sources because they do not show, like the classical state archives, the British, the French or German archives, does not show a geopolitical interest, but rather a pastoral and ecclesial interest. So they try to explain how these events told by the historians were perceived, were experienced and interpreted from the standpoint of the Catholic Church. So when we read and we study the events, we are immediately impressed by testimonies, eyewitnesses of those events, and testimonies coming from the local religious people. Very often they are the only witnesses to certain exterminations or deportations. Then there is the reaction of the Catholic Church, the hierarchy and the Vatican. So what was their reaction? To protect, to rescue, to save victims, survivors, orphans, with no distinction of sort, no confessional distinction, with no difference between Catholics, Protestants. Very often people say the Catholic Church did nothing for the Orthodox, they just protected the Catholic Armenians, but that is not true. There are multiple documents proving that from the very beginning, the hierarchy, with the Pope more specifically, intended to protect all Christians, regardless of their confession. What was the reaction of the Church? That of stopping massacres and deportations and to protect Christians, ensuring that Oriental churches could survive, those which were threatened, supporting the creation of an autonomous territory, independent land for Armenians and Syriacs. When it was not possible to have an autonomous territory, at least they were fighting so that the Christian minorities could have some guarantees. The national delegations of Christian Armenian, Syriac minorities always found an active listening from the Holy See at the end of the First World War, where projects for independent countries and autonomous territories were submitted, and they were always welcomed by the Vatican. As far as the Armenian issue is concerned, my investigations are getting to an I will focus on another issue which is as interesting and as important, and for this reason more in attention. The subject, the topic for which we are here, the Syriac Chaldean issue. During my research work, I found a number of documents linked to the issue of Chaldeans and Syriacs, and I have been focusing on those issues. I was at first focusing on Armenians, but I had to set aside those documents in the beginning, but I know that they exist. I know where they are placed. Your conference here is the final engine leading me to carry out a parallel research on this topic. In the third volume, dealing with the Armenian issue, I published accounts about the massacres of Syriacs, Chaldeans, Assyrians. Armenians were all, but I published those about the Gurnia and Salmas massacres in 1918. Those reports in the archives of congregations of Oriental churches. In these massacres, Monsignor Thomas Audo, the Chaldean Archbishop, Monsignor Emisantag, Apostolic Delegate in Mesopotamia, and the Patriarchs Marsimun Benjamin. So here, the reports about massacres of brothers Fratel Elias and Father Châtelet, both missionaries in Persia, and the tales of Monsignor Aziz, Chaldean bishop in Salmas, without forgetting the numerous reports of Ten, who was the apostolic administrator of the apostolic measure. And they tell the story of all these events, providing many details. So thinking of future publication, a more exhaustive publication on the Assyrian, Chaldean and Syriac issue, commemorating Seyfo. I'd like to very quickly outline the way in which this research project will be carried out. The example I'm about to give is the example on the Armenian issue. The first two volumes deal with 1894-1906, the Armenian massacre. Professor Actor was referring to the Armenian massacres, as Professor Ternon reminded us, are inspired by the pan-Islamic movement, trying to strengthen and reinforce the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. They started in 1894. In 95, 96, and 7, they ended under the pressure made internationally. Professor Ternon is here. I was thinking that he had left. Too bad, but whereas you are here. So I'm very pleased to find you here. I'm so happy to have you back with us. So we need to recognize that he's a deus ex machina. But these massacres declined thanks to international pressure. And even though the exact number of Armenian victims is not well known, but thanks to the Director General of the Oriental Work, we know that this number is around 300,000 victims. The Holy See intervened more in this painful episode, thanks to the of Pope Leo XIII. That mediation was proposed by the Sultan himself, who wanted to maintain his authority and gain time vis-à-vis the pressures made by the great powers. This was the goal of the Sultan in asking the mediation of the Pope Leo XIII. So the Sultan will be required to introduce reforms, mixed guardians, both Muslim and Christian governors for some provinces of the empire inhabited by Armenians. And Pope Leo XIII, in a letter to Sultan Abdulhamid II, expressed all his concern as to the tragic events in the Armenian nation, and he begged to have peace in the empire for the good of all the subjects. Then 5 volumes for the 1905-1925 period of time. 1905, we have riots in Van and the strong repression following those riots, and then massacres in Adana, April 1909, and then the genocide of 1915. We need to notice, and I'd like to take this opportunity to do that, and I always do that when I deal with this topic. So we need to stress that the only sovereign, the only religious leader who officially protested against the atrocities perpetrated in those years was Pope Benedict XVI. He was the only religious leader who actually protested. Benedict XV, I apologize. And I have 2 letters to Sultan Muhammad V. In these letters, Pope Benedict XV said clearly what he thought. The Armenian nation has already seen many of its children put to death. Many were put in jail or sent or exiled. Many priests, many bishops, and entire peoples, villages must be, these people must leave their homes and move to the Great Plains, and they are in pain, they are mourning. They also have to suffer the deprivation of misery and the torture of hunger. So the protest of Benedict XV had the effect to slow down massacres, but not to stop them in a final manner. The second letter of Pope Benedict XV is of March 1918, and he voices his concerns about massacres in Armenians of the Caucasus. And I'd like to quote the second letter of the Sultan. The consequence of our prayers, this proof of the of the availability of the Sultan, leads us to share with you our new concerns, the fears we have that for these peoples must go through the terrible suffering of they already experienced in the past because of the peace treaty that the army imposed to Russia. So huge territories are dominated by Turkey, and those lands are mostly inhabited by Armenians. Save them, spare them, protect the population from the conflict. My books do not just analyze the end of the World War. They go up to 1925, even 1930. So when we start doing research on a topic, we realize that we keep working until the year that in the beginning we set as the final year of our research. We needed to tell a story to the very end. So we had to talk about the change of regime under the aegis of Mustafa Kemal, and also the persecutions of Armenians that were resumed in many ways through massacres, deportations, forced exile, forced conversion to Islam, which characterized the years following the war. There is a chapter in the book dealing with the agreement of March 21 and also the French-Turkish treaty that will be essential for the Armenian nation. And as the professor reminded us, there were very serious events. So the diplomatic action of the Holy See can be found throughout this period of time. So this shows the important network of nuncios and apostolic delegates, Monsignor Eugenio Pacelli, who will then become Pope Pius XII. He was involved in the topic too. There is a diplomatic correspondence with him, also with Cardinal von Hartmann, the Archbishop of Munich, which deals with this. So the network of apostolic delegates is essential. I'd like to remind you the heroic figure of Monsignor Angelo Maria Dolce in Constantinople that was nicknamed the Angel of Armenians, the angel protecting the Armenians. And he has witnessed the tragic destiny of the Armenian nation, trying to help them. He didn't just intervene in terms of defending them against massacres, but the Holy See also sent humanitarian aid to victims, refugees, and many Armenian orphans that were welcomed in Castel Gandolfo. About 70 little orphans, especially girls, they were housed in the pontifical palace for a long time. So this humanitarian aid is key, especially because at the time there were no NGOs. There was just the Red Cross. Then the Neris Relief was founded because of such atrocities. Another field in which the Holy See has been involved was the creation of a National Armenian House, the National Armenian House, which was free. Pope Benedict XV was the first to talk about this topic of an autonomous territory for Armenians in August 1517. In this peace notice, he says that with the same spirit of justice, territorial issues will have to be dealt with, especially those concerning Armenia, Balkan states, and the territories of the former Polish kingdom. There are two countries which are named, Armenia and Poland. The Pope himself, 3 days before the end of the First World War, sent a letter to the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to remember once again the importance of creating a free and independent Armenia. He will do the same for Poland. In this letter, he will mention both Armenia and Poland. And I will quote, after talking about Poland, he says, "There is another nation deserving to receive your sympathy and that of all people having a good heart." I'm referring to Armenia. Useless to say to what extent this nation has been suffering over the last few years, even though the Armenian people, in most cases, do not belong to the Catholic religion. Here there is no confessional issue. The Holy See, even though it was not a Catholic, they were not Catholic, has been frequently involved in defending these populations, right into the Salta, in order to stop massacres, or by sending aid in order to relieve their pain and suffering. But the Pope says all of that is useless unless we recognize full independence for united Armenia, an independence that they deserved from all standpoints. And this is why mankind as a whole is looking at the president of the biggest democracy in the world with great interest. So following the desperate situation of Armenians in Cilicia, the diplomatic efforts of the Holy See in favor of independent Armenia will double thanks to the Apostolic Nuncio in Paris. During the Conference of Lausanne, also in Bern, the efforts of another Apostolic Nuncio. So to the very end, the Holy See will fight in order to receive guarantees to defend the rights of Christian minorities in Turkey. But all this work will be useless. Turkish delegations will be inflexible, and Western powers, being tired of negotiations, will be satisfied with just vague promises. So the ethnic cleansing of Christians in Turkey will go on. Confiscation of property abandoned by Christians, or the law on the mandatory teaching of history and geography by Turkish teachers. So this cleansing will go on up to paroxystic levels, with the pressures of Kemalists of a number of minorities, Greek, Armenian, and Jewish minorities, pressures by Kemalists so that they would give up their rights, which were already quite few rights in the Lausanne Treaty. But the Holy See will never stopped fighting. Through this diplomatic network and through the Society of Nations, through the apostolic nuncios and delegates throughout the world, to try it and fight against the cleansing policy. A specific report will be drafted on this and submitted to the Society of Nations, with this under the edges of the Vatican. But this effort will be in vain again, because Turkey at the time was not a member of the Society of Nations. So out of the 15 Armenian dioceses in Turkey, in the end, just a few traces will remain, and the Armenian Catholic Patriarch will move from Constantinople to Lebanon. Despite the results achieved thanks to the humanitarian action in favor of the Armenian Church, the Catholic Church will be recognized by Armenians. Armenians will recognize the efforts of the Church. Already at the time, many letters and many testimonies were expressed by patriarchs, especially the Patriarch Zaven, and also the Catholic Patriarch Savak in Cilicia. So they thanked for the work done by the Holy See. And there will be the inauguration of the bronze statue of Benedict XV, one of the very few statues of this Pope in the world. There are very few such statues of this Pope in the world. One in the Vatican Basilica, but not many others. Whereas there we have a bronze statue opposite the Catholic Cathedral in Constantinople, inaugurated in December 1921. This statue, even though the initiative dates back to the apostolic delegate Dolce, was sponsored through a public subscription. So it was paid by non-Catholics, non-Christians. There is no Catholic money was used for this statue. So the 7 volumes on the Armenian issue reproduce faithfully the timing of these documents at the Vatican. In most cases, they were not published. The Armenian Catholic Catherine II, in the closing speech for the solemn Mass commemorating the Armenian genocide on April the 12th, thanked the Holy See for their friendship and inflexible support to the Armenian nation. He also expressed his appreciation for the publication of documents of the Vatican archives. Quote, Hurricane said, during this divine liturgy celebrated in memory of our innocent victims on the centennial of the Armenian genocide, we do this in memory of the predecessors of His Holiness, Pope Benedict XV, who protested against the genocide of Armenians, and Holy Father John Paul II, that in 2001 recognized and condemned the Armenian genocide. In this regard, the publication of unpublished documents in Vatican archives is extremely important, and I deeply believe that we could do the same very fruitfully for the Syriac, Chaldean and Assyrian issue, to commemorate this awful sword of death that 100 years ago affected Syriacs, Assyrians and Chaldeans during the First World War. Thank you so much for your attention.
It's a public commitment. Allora, se Gesù.
Thank you, Father Georges. It's very important to speak of funds, which is, or the sources, which is a specialty for the Jesuits. I studied Italian in the University for Foreigners in Perugia, and they offer an intensive course, just so you know. Modern Turkey continues to, or contemporary Turkey rather, continues to refuse the notion of the Syriac genocide. And when I refer to the Syriac genocide, I also refer to the Armenian genocide, but I'm referring to the churches who speak Syriac. Turkey says that there are no sources. Therefore, thank you very much, Father Georges, for this wonderful presentation. Are there any questions? Any remarks, maybe? Holiness? Both of them have a single voice. On behalf of my brother, His Holiness Ignacio Ephraim II, on behalf of the audience also, we simply want to reiterate our gratitude and our appreciation to all of the scientists, all of the speakers who contributed with their scientific research. This is 2015, the 100th anniversary of what we have all referred to as a genocide. And I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that it is our responsibility to make sure that this genocide or genocides will never happen again. The Syriac genocide, the Armenian genocide. And we have to be brave in saying that liberty is something that can free us. Truth is also something which can help us in our countries. And truth will help our sons and daughters and our grandchildren to stay in their homeland. It is true that we are living in difficult times, and therefore I simply want to repeat something that I feel deep down in my heart. And I want to say this as loud as I can. The silent majority needs to have the courage to speak out to those who govern them. You Europeans, our European friends, live in so-called democratic states. You have the so-called free press. You have political and cultural pluralism. And we ask you to help your brothers and sisters in the Middle East to stay in their homelands. But it's not enough to just send some food and some medicine, although we are very grateful for your solidarity. But what we truly need is to become true citizens in our homeland, in our places of birth. We want to have the same rights and the same obligations, just like every other citizen, with no discrimination. Not just for those of us who are Christians, but for all other minorities as well. Thank you. We want to thank the Lord because you always speak very clearly and with a very loud voice, just like John the Baptist. Are there any other remarks or questions from the audience? All right then, I'd now like to give the floor to Professor Marco Impagliazzo. He is a professor of contemporary history at the University for Foreigners in Perugia. I don't think I have to read his entire CV. Although he is a consultant for a number of pontifical councils. He is also the president of the Sant'Egidio community since 2003, and he may even be re-elected. You have the floor, Professor. This is part of my electoral campaign, as you can tell. Dear friends, drawing conclusions is very difficult. We've had this international conference in the presence of His Holiness Patriarch Marafrem, in the presence of His Beatitude Patriarch Yonan, and so many bishops from the Syriac Church and other churches, authorities from the Holy See. I would like to greet Monsignor Fabo, Monsignor Paglia, and so many people who truly took part in this conference with scientific and emotional enthusiasm. If French rationality allows me to say these things. We have listened to a number of very important things over the past 2 days. And I'd like to begin by saying that, unfortunately, The Latins taught us that historia magistra vitam. In other words, history should be the teachers for our life. And I'm grateful to Professor Riccardi because ever since I started studying history, whenever I attended his lessons at the University of Rome, what he always explained to his students, including myself, that this motto wasn't applied very often. The opposite would have been wonderful, although history hasn't taught us very much on a number of occasions. And as Patriarch Yunnan was saying, the fact that we're here to remember the centennial of these events and to remember, as our friend Norris Atto did, if we're here to remember the suffering of so many Christians in those same lands nowadays, belonging to those same churches nowadays, well, that just goes to show that unfortunately history doesn't always teach us. Perhaps due to the fact that its students simply don't want to listen. And that's why I think that a meeting such as ours is so important. Because it truly helps us to remember. It helps us to remember the many victims. And it helps us to raise a stronger, a more vigorous awareness. It conveys the message that we have to teach ourselves and we have to teach our children that these things should no longer happen. As Professor Riccardi said yesterday, remembering doesn't mean wanting revenge. And as Jean Kawak also said this morning, we don't want to remember to seek revenge on anyone. We want to remember because we need to have an active memory towards the victims. Professor Riccardi used the Latin term pietas, a way of actively remembering the victims. But we also want to share this memory with the generations who will follow. I was moved by the words spoken by His Holiness when he introduced our conference yesterday. He said that we are here to heal wounds. We are here to heal wounds. And after having listened to so many dramatic stories, I feel that this conference can heal the wounds of so many people, of so many of the descendants of the victims, the wounds of the Syriac Church, which has suffered so much, and which, through the memory of the Seyfo, can find a new cure to heal the wounds. Because the Syriac Church can feel, through events such as this, that you are not alone. Your church, Holiness, Beatitude, your church is not alone. And the meeting with Pope Francis yesterday testifies to that. You are not alone. We have heard that you are defenseless, apolitical, and peaceful Christians. This is your history. Differently from the Armenians, as Father Rusin mentioned, you have never had a nation. So much so that Pope Benedict XV spoke of Poland and he spoke of Armenia, but he couldn't speak of your nation. And therefore, this weakness of yours can also be a strength, because you want to depict yourselves as a church which isn't seeking for revenge, not simply as a church who wants rights. You are a church which wants to be free to be Christian. You want to express the freedom of the gospel. You want to be free to be monks. You want to be free to live your wonderful religious experience, as we were able to appreciate through your beautiful hymns. And the prayer yesterday was something I found particularly moving. One of the prayers you sang yesterday the prayer for the martyrs. You, O blessed martyrs, are remembered here and in the heavens. May your prayers help those who honor your memory. And after all, this history of martyrdom is also a history that can help us help those who are honoring this memory nowadays. And I feel that we have to thank all those who have been studying this issue for so many years. Professor Riccardi, Professor Yacoub, Professor Florence Elobelier, Professor Yves Tournon, Professor Gaunt, Norris Atto, Professor Rusin. We have to thank all of you, because for years you have had the courage and the intelligence needed to study and to disseminate information on a topic which has been forgotten for far too long. And I think that takes a great deal of bravery. Professor Tournon is a pioneer in this field of research, and I want to thank him on behalf of all of us. Many things happen by chance, as Professor Gaunt also said. I met the Syriacs by chance, myself. You too. But there is a common history which guides us. You weren't born to be a historian. You were born to be a physician, a surgeon. And that's what I was. And I think that our responsibility, the responsibility of all those who have talked about this topic, is the responsibility of continuing to promote these studies. And I think that this conference is important because I feel it opens up a new era of research. And Father Ruisen's commitment is very important. He committed to publishing information on the Syriacs contained in the Vatican Archive. Father Ruisen's decision, he's a young scholar, testifies to a new generation of scholars who want to continue to investigate deeply. And that's the possibility history gives you. It gives you the possibility of digging deep into the information. And this is, I think, something which needs to be conveyed to the new generation of scholars. And after 100 years, we can close a chapter and open up a new chapter through this conference. And we need a new chapter because we need to find a new form of narrating these events. For years, we were able to live together with the witnesses of those tragic events. Unfortunately, they are no longer with us, and therefore we need to find new ways to enrich our sources, to strengthen our research, so that we can continue to discuss what took place. And I think that those events also need to be linked to the present. Through this research, through these studies, we have to start imagining a future a future for Christians in the contemporary Middle East. I know it's difficult, but something needs to be done. We have to protest. We have to ask our diplomats and our governors to help us. And as we did in Bari recently, in a conference, we have to bring together all of the leaders of the churches of the Middle East. We have to try to imagine what the future for Christians in the Middle East may be. And I think that by studying history, we'll also be able to find solutions or ideas for the future. I feel this conference is also useful as a way of reminding the international community. And I'll say this today, on the day in which we celebrate refugees. Today is the World Refugee Day. And through the words of Nodus Atto, hostages in the homeland, orphans in the diaspora. Hostages in the homeland, orphans in the diaspora. This is a major issue we have to deal with. For so many people who are hostages in their homeland and they haven't been welcomed anywhere outside of their homeland. And among these people, among these refugees, I also want to remember the many Middle Eastern Christians who are fleeing from Syria, who fled from Iraq, who found a haven in Lebanon and Jordan and other countries, people who are knocking on the doors of Europe, America, or Canada. And therefore, World Refugee Day is a memory which further helps us deal with these issues. We have also repeated, as Father Ruisen and Professor Riccardi did, we also repeated the words of Pope Benedict XVI. And the Patriarch also wanted to remember what Pope Francis said on April 12th in St. Peter's Square, and he repeated those words yesterday during his prayer. It's very important. It's wonderful to see the unity which exists between Christians, a unity which was reborn through martyrdom, something which didn't exist 100 years ago. As we heard, the Christians were divided, and perhaps this weakness brought about further problems during the genocide. But I believe that nowadays this is no longer true. We are united in martyrdom, and it's important that two popes, Benedict XV and Francis, have expressed their view very clearly on the events which happened 100 years ago. I think this is very significant indeed. Christians united in martyrdom. And the next step is to make sure that our voices are heard. We need to help you to be heard. We need to be even more united so that our voice can reach the ears of those who govern us. A war which has been going on so long is not acceptable, and I'm referring to the war in Syria, which is just as long as World War I was. It's something perverse, unimaginable, it's absurd, and yet that is how things are. And we have to continue reiterating the fact that we do not want this to continue. I want to also say, very humbly, that the work conducted by the Sant'Egidio community, the historical research, the memory of the martyrs, and the friendship with the Syriac Church, the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Syrian Catholic Church, and other churches in the Middle East, is the expression of a loyalty which perhaps has helped you to feel less alone. And perhaps it has also allowed you to understand that here in the West, you have friends who think of you and pray for you, just like the bishops, the kidnapped bishops who we remember every night in our prayers. And I also remember some 15 years ago, and this goes back to what Nodus Atto was saying, I remember what our community did in Germany to recognize so many Syriacs, to have them recognized as refugees. This was a major effort at the time. And Roberto Merozzo, I'm sure, remembers this. And finally, a number of families were accepted in Germany. They were hosted there thanks to the efforts of the Sant'Egidio community in Germany. And at the same time, I also want to add that there are some new elements which are emerging. Together with Professor Riccardi, we visited Tur Abdin 2 years ago, and we saw that the Syriac churches have been restored and refurbished with the support of your diaspora, but also and especially thanks to the Patriarch's intelligence, thanks to the fact that you indicated that the church had to be restored. The church asked, and its followers answered. And therefore, visiting to Aberdeen today means seeing churches in their full dignity, with believers in them. And I met a 15-year-old boy who would travel there every summer to study the Syriac language as a way of remembering your language. I just met one young man, but there are many others like him. So this is, I think, something which testifies to some sort of a return. I know you don't agree with me, but that's democracy. We can have different opinions. So-called democracies. It seems to me that an underlying element in all the things we said is the awareness, as Professor Ternon was saying, and as Andrea Riccardi was saying yesterday, the awareness that all of this also happened due to the war. War in general and World War I specifically. No war up to then could even be compared to the tragedy of the First World War. And what I can add is that no other massacre prior to that can be compared to the massacre of the Christians. No war up to World War I could even be compared to it due to the levels of atrocity. At the same time, no slaughter can be compared to the slaughter of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire during World War I. And especially after the Shoah, that's where the term genocide came about. That's something we have to remember. And in fact, the denial of all this has also been very strong throughout history. But as Professor Ternon was saying, we have to understand that war is virage. It's a tournant. It's something which makes atrocity possible. War makes atrocity possible. And one such atrocity, besides the many human atrocities which were mentioned, is that of transferring the Syrian Orthodox Patriarchate from Dar al-Safan to Homs, a patriarchate which had been there since the 1200s. 7 centuries of history which were erased, transferred to Homs and then to Damascus. 7 centuries of history which were erased in no time. Because when the headquarters of a patriarchate of an Eastern church are moved elsewhere, we know the deep meaning this has. And the lives of the monasteries. We remember the Maraljan martyrs. We remembered a life in the monasteries, which allowed your church to grow. Therefore, war is something which allows the greatest evil to take place. Nationalist madness knows no borders. Securing borders became an obsession, and all of this brought about the creation of the culture of the enemy and all the other consequences of war. Therefore, 100 years later, we have a further strength. The strength of our documents, the strength of the testimonies we heard. And as His Holiness was saying, we finally have the strength to pray and to speak out, to describe what happened to our victims, which is what happened with the victims of the Shoah. Think of how many people refused to talk about what had happened to them due to the deep wounds they had suffered. And the balm that can heal the wounds gives you the possibility to speak out. Not as a way of seeking revenge, but as a way of bringing about reconciliation and a future, hopefully, together with the same people who forced you out 100 years ago. I have two final things I'd like to share with you. World War I and Seyfo, as I said, brought about the utmost evil. But those weren't lawless times. The genocide, this evil, happened despite international law. Without international humanitarian law, which is the one that we now have, we still had the Hague Convention. We had the Martens Clause. Laws did exist to safeguard civilians. And as the Martens Clause states, the Martens Clause, drafted in 1899, civilians are to be protected by the principles of the rights of people. The principles of humanity and the principles of conscience. These were the laws which governed the world at the time. And yet these laws were ignored. And defenseless civilians were attacked. People who didn't even have weapons. Just a few hunting rifles, perhaps. There is a law for people. There is a humanitarian law. And people have to be respected. Their lives have to be respected. This is something which should protect everyone. And we're saying this today on World Refugee Day. And my final point is an idea that Professor Riccardi spoke to the Italian press about a few months ago with an article in the Corriere della Sera newspaper. And he described the constant attacks towards Christians in Pakistan, in Nigeria, and elsewhere. A new image of Christianity is emerging through martyrdom. A church of martyrs and a new image for Christianity. It is no longer an all-knowing church. It is no longer a powerful church. It is no longer a church involved in politics. It is no longer the church as it is often described. A church which is involved in a number of political and economic issues. It gives us a new image of a defenseless church, a church of martyrs, a church which gives its life for its faith. We want to thank you because this is the image of a church that you have conveyed to us. This is the image that your fathers have conveyed through the drama, through the dramatic events that Seyfo were. Thank you.
Sayyidina. Allora diamo la parola adesso a Sua Santità.
We now want to give the floor to His Holiness Patriarch Ignatius Ephraim II.
To that of my dear brother, More Ignatius Yusuf III, in thanking all the speakers for the presentations that they made, for the information that they gave us, and for the passion with which they spoke about the subject. All of us learned new things today, including with the descendants of the survivors, about what happened to our forefathers. Leaving this room at the end of the first session, Bishop Paglia took me on the side and he was very emotional, and he told me, we are a family today. Today I have discovered that we are just a family. You are us, we are you. Professor Marco, you spoke about the suffering church. Today I believe you understand even more what our church is, how our church lived, how our people lived. We were never an imperial or a state church. And I told the professor Ricardi thanks God for that. Nowadays, when I talk about the marks of the church, I don't say only one Holy Catholic Apostolic. I say one Holy Catholic Apostolic and suffering church. I believe the mark of the suffering is part of the church, and we have lived it throughout our history, and we continue to live it. Now, where do we go from here? Definitely today we know more and more people know about Seyfo than yesterday, and we are grateful for that. We're grateful to Sant'Egidio for making that possible. But this is only the beginning of a path of reconciliation, of healing. A few weeks ago in Damascus, after the Sunday service, usually after the service, I go to the main salon, and then some people come from the church and sit with me. They start telling me stories. We drink coffee together, always small, not lungo. An old lady comes to me and sits next to me and says, Your Holiness, today, these days, you gave me great comfort. Tell her, what do you mean? She says, because for 80 years I was not able to talk about Seyfo, about what happened to my mother, to her mother. How as a child she was taken away from her mother, from her parents, and forced into to join Islamic families, and then later she was saved by others. She told me, for 80 years, I was not allowed to talk about it. My mother would not even mention it. She would not be able to mention it. It was a taboo in our house. But since you have started this commemoration process, and the church as a whole talking about we are now, I feel more comfortable. She started healing her wounds. That's exactly what we are trying to do here. We're trying to heal ourselves, our wounds, and also we're trying to make others, especially our friends in Turkey, to understand that our attempt, our commemoration is not to fight with them or to take revenge, but rather to help them also understand their past and be reconciled to their past. They don't see it this way right now, but I'm hoping in the future they will see it like this. Some Turkish officials were asking our people in Turkey, why is your patriarch, new patriarch, all of a sudden talking about Seyfo? Is the Syrian government putting pressure on him to do that? You know, given the geopolitical situation of the day. I mean, they don't see the necessity for us to talk about it. They cannot even imagine us talking about it. How can we keep silent anymore? How can we keep silent? Since I was a little child in my hometown in Qamishli, I used to go to church every evening, every afternoon for the evening prayer. We would go at least an hour earlier than the prayer time. I would sit among the elderly people there, and I would listen to their stories talking about Seyfo. These were the survivors, talking about 30, 40 years ago. These were the survivors. They were in their 60s and 70s. And they would tell me what happened in their villages. They would come from different villages of Tur Abdin. And each will talk about their experiences and their parents and their grandparents and what happened to their families, how they devastated, how their families were broken. I heard that since I was 5 and 6 years old. And how can I not talk about it? I don't care about the relationship between Syria and Turkey. That's not my issue today. My issue is our people who have been suffering for hundreds of years. Is it too much for us to try to have some comfort, to talk about our history, to have some peace. Is it too much for us? I'm grateful to all of you, really, for what you have done. And I'm hoping that more work will be done in this regard. And I'm so grateful also that our own Syriac people have started this research and examination of our history. So grateful for the presence of both Professor Yaqub, Joseph Yaqub, and also Nauras, of course, all of you eminent scholars, but these two, they talk about their family's experience, so it's something very close to them, and I just hope more of our young people will come forward and try to study what happened. But I'm also grateful for the support we are seeing from our brothers and sisters here, both from the Vatican, as well as from Sant'Egidio community. I mean, His Holiness words on April 12 will always be remembered because they are historical words. And we believe now that we are more visible on the radar of the international community. We believe that now we mean something to some other people. So others are sympathetic with us, they feel with us, and they are trying to help us to come to terms with what we went through. Professor Marco touched upon many important issues in his conclusion, and I appreciate that. But I think the most important thing for us now is to continue this process through scholarly research as well as through public events, which we are trying to organize. Next week, I'm attending a conference in Berlin, organized by the Free University of Berlin about the same topic, Seyfo, and there's so many other events that we cannot go and attend personally, but I believe the support of you, audience in this room, and many more thousands of people throughout the world is encouraging us to go forward with this process of reconciliation. I cannot see it any other way. Therefore, I would like to reiterate my thanks, gratitude of not only the Syrian Orthodox Church, but all the Syriac speaking church, His Beatitude, Patriarch Yunan, members of the Chaldean Church, of the Assyrian Church of the East. We all are united in this. In thanking you and looking forward to continuing this process until we have peace of mind, but also we have peace in our land. I don't want future generations after 100 years to come together like we are doing now to say in 2014 and 15 there was a genocide in the Middle East and thousands of Christians were killed and hundreds of thousands, millions of them were expelled. Hopefully they don't have to do that again, to come together to condemn or to explain what happened. Now, today, we should do something about what's happening right now in the Middle East. And the European countries do have responsibility, not only responsibility toward us, but toward their own populations, towards their own citizens, because terrorism will not stop in Syria, will not stop in Iraq. Killing of Christians is not only in the Middle East, it's throughout the world, and Europe is not immune. It may not be violence directed against specifically Christians, but it will be violence against the culture that you have, you live, your way of living. And it's time to stop that so that doesn't come here also. I know it's already here, it's already in Europe, it's already in America. But it can be much worse, God forbid. So, once again, thank you so much. God bless you. And it has been truly a remarkable day for all of us here. Thank you.
Allora, grazie mille, Baruch Seyfo.
Thank you very much. We have reached the conclusion of our conference. Thank you very much to the Sant'Egidio community. Thank you very much to all of you.